like, subscribe, and share. Weekly updates with a scary moment. In the heart of the fog-shrouded English town of Ashwood lay an enclave of wealth and status, Ravenswood Court. This newly built luxury residential complex had quickly become home to some of the town's most affluent residents, each drawn to the secluded tranquility that the area offered. The towering oaks and meticulously landscaped grounds provided an air of exclusivity, but beneath the surface, there was an unsettling stillness, one that seemed to whisper of something old and forgotten. Tom Carter, a man well into his 60s with a face weathered by years of outdoor work, had taken up the position of night watchman and parking lot attendant at Ravenswood Court shortly after its completion. Though his posture had stooped with age, his eyes retained a sharpness, a remnant of his younger days as a soldier. He had chosen this job for its quiet nature, thinking it would be an easy way to pass the time as he edged toward retirement. Yet, as the weeks wore on, Tom began to notice things, small, almost imperceptible oddities that gnawed at the edges of his mind. It was on a particularly cold and misty night that Tom first heard it, the faint crackling of the radio on his desk. The semiconductor radio, his only companion during the long, lonely nights, had always been reliable. But recently, at the stroke of midnight, the signal would cut out, replaced by a steady hiss of static, as if something was interfering with the frequencies. Tom had been fiddling with the dials, his brow furrowed in concentration, when he heard a muffled sound, like something scratching beneath the floorboards. He paused, the breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought it might be the pipes, but then he realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, as if something was moving just out of sight. He put down the radio and listened, his senses alert. The noise grew louder, seeming to come from just under his feet. With a grimace, Tom grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness of his small booth. He had always prided himself on not being easily spooked, but something about this sound set his nerves on edge. He slowly crouched down, lifting the corner of the carpet, expecting to find some sort of vermin or perhaps a mechanical issue with the building's systems. But there was nothing. Tom frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as he stood back up, he was nearly blinded by the sudden flash of headlights. The beam swung through the parking lot as a car pulled up to the entrance of the underground garage. Tom cursed under his breath, shaking off the tension as he made his way to the control panel. It was unusual for residents to be out this late, and his curiosity was piqued. As he raised the barrier to allow the car into the garage, he caught a glimpse of the driver, a man with a haunted expression, his eyes wide with fear. In the back seat, something moved, but before Tom could get a good look, the car sped past, disappearing into the depths of the garage. A loud crash echoed from below, followed by a chilling silence. Tom's blood ran cold. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed into the stairwell, his old boots thudding heavily on the concrete steps. As he descended, the air grew colder, the familiar smell of damp concrete mingling with something else, something metallic. When Tom reached the lower level, the sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. The car had smashed into the far wall, the front crumpled like a tin can. The driver's side door was open, hanging limply on its hinges. Sprawled across the driver's seat was a woman, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair, blood seeping from a gash on her forehead. Tom approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight wavering slightly as he tried to steady his shaking hands. The woman's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and he could hear her muttering something under her breath, her voice hoarse and broken. He leaned in closer, straining to make out the words. In the tunnel, it was in the tunnel. Her voice was filled with a terror that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. He glanced over his shoulder at the long, dark tunnel that led deeper into the underground parking lot. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and for a moment, Tom thought he saw something moving, something not entirely human. He turned back to the woman, but her eyes were already glazing over, her body going limp as she lost consciousness. Tom's heart raced as he pulled out his mobile phone to call for help, but before he could dial, he heard it again, the same scratching sound from before, only this time, it was much louder ... and it was coming from the tunnel. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the scratching sound grew louder, echoing through the dark, empty tunnel. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he directed it toward the darkness, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the duty to investigate. He had been a soldier once. He had faced down men with guns and survived. But this was different. This was something he couldn't see, something he couldn't fight. Steeling himself, Tom took a cautious step forward, the sound of his boots against the concrete floor seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. He moved slowly, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness, revealing nothing but the cold, empty space of the underground parking lot. The walls were bare, the air heavy with the scent of gasoline and oil. The car crash lay forgotten behind him as Tom pressed on, drawn inexplicably toward the source of the noise. It was as if the sound had a physical pull, urging him deeper into the shadows. The scratching grew more frantic, more desperate, like nails clawing against metal. The noise reverberated off the walls, filling the tunnel with an almost unbearable tension. As Tom approached a bend in the tunnel, the sound abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. He paused, holding his breath, straining to hear any hint of movement. But there was nothing, only the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He rounded the corner slowly, his flashlight leading the way. The beam fell on something strange and old, rusted metal door set into the wall, half hidden by shadows. It looked out of place in the otherwise modern complex, its surface pitted and scarred with age. Tom hadn't noticed it before, but then again, he had never had reason to venture this deep into the garage. Tom hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's handle. A sense of foreboding washed over him, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave whatever lay beyond that door undisturbed. But curiosity, and something darker, urged him to push forward. With a deep breath, he grasped the handle and pulled. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the tunnel, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The air that wafted out was musty and stale, carrying with it the faint scent of something long dead. Tom's stomach turned, but he forced himself to step inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The passageway was barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, the walls rough and uneven, as if they had been carved out of the earth rather than built. Tom's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the passage, the beam casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the air growing heavier with each step. Then, he saw a figure hunched over in the distance, shrouded in darkness. It was small, no larger than a child, and it moved with a slow, deliberate motion, as if it were searching for something. Tom froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stopped, its head turning slowly toward him. Tom's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, he saw the figure's face, a pale, gaunt visage with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. It was a child, but not a living one. The boy's skin was ashen, stretched tight over sharp bones, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. Tom's body refused to move, paralyzed by the sight before him. The boy's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, Tom knew he was looking at something not of this world. The boy's mouth moved, forming words that Tom couldn't hear, but the intent was clear. He was trying to tell Tom something important. Before Tom could react, the boy turned and fled down the passageway, his form dissolving into the shadows. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, fading into the distance. Tom stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. Finally, his legs obeyed him, and he turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled back through the tunnel, his flashlight flickering wildly as he ran. The walls seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing down on him like a weight. He reached the metal door and flung it open, practically throwing himself back into the relative safety of the parking lot. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps as he leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to steady himself. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but one thing was clear: whatever he had seen in that tunnel was real. And it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He needed to tell someone, anyone, but who would believe him? His thoughts turned to the woman in the car. She had seen something too, something that had driven her to crash. Was it the same thing? Had she seen the boy, or was there something else lurking in the shadows of Ravenswood Court? Tom was still lost in his thoughts when the sound of footsteps echoed through the parking lot. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the concrete floor, revealing the figure of a man walking toward him. It was William Thompson, one of the newer residents at Ravenswood Court. William was a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s, with a sharp, handsome face and an air of quiet confidence. He had moved into the complex with his wife, Emily, and their young son, Henry, just a few weeks ago. Tom had seen them around, but he had never spoken to them at length. "Tom, is everything all right?" William's voice was calm, but there was a note of concern in his eyes as he approached. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he had just experienced without sounding like a madman? He swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I'm not sure," Tom finally managed, his voice trembling slightly. "There was an accident. A woman, she crashed her car. She's hurt, but but that's not all. I think there's something down here. Something unnatural." William's brow furrowed as he listened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He glanced past Tom, toward the darkened tunnel, as if expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but the tunnel remained empty, silent. "Where is the woman now?" William asked, his voice steady. "Back there, in the car," Tom replied, gesturing toward the wreckage. William nodded and moved past Tom, his footsteps echoing through the parking lot. Tom followed, his nerves still on edge, but grateful for the company. As they approached the car, Tom could see the woman slumped over in the driver's seat, her breathing shallow but steady. William crouched down beside the car, checking her pulse. "She's alive, but she needs medical attention. I'll call an ambulance." Tom watched as William pulled out his phone and dialed, his voice calm and composed as he spoke to the emergency operator. Tom felt a pang of guilt. He should have done that immediately, but his mind had been too clouded with fear and confusion. As William made the call, Tom's gaze drifted back to the tunnel. The darkness seemed even more oppressive now, as if it were watching him, waiting. He could still feel the boy's hollow eyes boring into him, the memory sending a shiver down his spine. When William finished the call, he turned to Tom, his expression serious. "The ambulance is on its way. They should be here soon." Tom nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whatever was in that tunnel was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. "William," Tom began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you. I don't know if you'll believe me, but I saw something down there. A boy, or something that looked like a boy. It wasn't human." William's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze shifting to the tunnel. "A boy? What did he look like?" Tom hesitated, trying to put the image into words. He was small, pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were empty, hollow, and he tried to speak to me, but I couldn't hear him. William was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Tom's surprise, he nodded slowly. "I believe you, Tom. I've seen things too, things I can't explain. But this place there's something wrong with it." I felt it the moment we moved in. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. William had seen it too, whatever it was. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a growing sense of dread. If they were both seeing these things, then that meant they were real, and that meant they were in danger. "What do we do?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William didn't answer right away. He stared into the darkness of the tunnel, his jaw clenched, as if he were wrestling with a decision. Finally, he turned back to Tom, his eyes filled with resolve. "We find out what this place is hiding," William said quietly, "and we put a stop to it." William's words hung heavy in the air, a resolve that seemed to resonate within the cold walls of the underground parking lot. Tom felt a strange mixture of fear and determination bubbling within him. He wasn't sure what they would find, but he knew that, whatever it was, it had to be confronted. As they waited for the ambulance, Tom's thoughts kept drifting back to the rusted door and the ghostly boy he had seen. What was the connection? Why did that boy seem so real, yet so impossible? The wail of sirens in the distance finally broke the silence, and soon after, the paramedics arrived. They worked quickly, moving the injured woman onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance. Tom and William watched as the vehicle sped away, red lights flashing through the mist that cloaked Ravenswood Court. With the woman gone, the parking lot seemed to grow even colder, the shadows deeper. Tom turned to William, still feeling the weight of what they had experienced. "What now?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. William sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "There's something I need to show you, Tom, something I haven't told anyone about. But after what you saw tonight, I think it might be connected." Tom frowned but nodded. He had known William only a short while, but there was a seriousness in his tone that made Tom trust him. "All right," Tom said. "Lead the way." They made their way out of the parking lot and into the main building of Ravenswood Court. The grand lobby, with its marble floors and chandeliers, was eerily quiet at this hour. The only sound was the soft echo of their footsteps as they crossed the expansive space. William's apartment was on the top floor, and they took the elevator up in silence. Tom could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken worrying that whatever they were dealing with was more than just a ghost story. When they reached the penthouse, William unlocked the door and stepped inside, gesturing for Tom to follow. The apartment was luxurious, with sleek modern furniture and large windows that offered a view of the town below, now shrouded in mist. But there was something about the place that felt off, like it was too still, too perfect. It was as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. William led Tom down a hallway and into a study at the back of the apartment. The room was spacious, lined with dark wooden bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A large desk sat in the center, its surface immaculate except for a single lamp that cast a warm glow over the space. The walls were adorned with various artifacts, sold maps, framed documents, and other curiosities that hinted at William's interest in history. But what drew Tom's attention was a large bookshelf on the far wall. Unlike the others, this one seemed slightly out of place, as if it didn't quite belong. William walked over to it, his expression unreadable, and then reached up to the top shelf. With a deliberate motion, he pulled down a thick book, a dusty, old volume with a cracked leather cover. He set it aside, revealing a small, hidden panel behind it. With a soft click, William pressed the panel, and the entire bookshelf began to move. Tom watched in awe as it slid silently to the side, revealing a darkened room beyond. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled faintly of incense and old wood. "This is what I wanted to show you," William said, his voice low. "This room, I found it when we first moved in. I didn't tell Emily, I didn't tell anyone. I thought it was just some hidden storage area. But then, things started happening." Tom peered into the room, the light from the study barely penetrating the gloom within. "What kind of things?" William stepped inside, and Tom followed, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. The room was small, more of a chamber, really, with low ceilings and walls lined with dark wood panels. In the center of the room was a large, ornate table, upon which rested an array of strange objects, candles, small statues, and what looked like an ancient tome. But what immediately caught Tom's attention was a large, carved wooden object sitting in the corner of the room. It was a coffin, an old, intricately designed coffin made of ebony, its surface polished to a dark, almost liquid sheen. Good God, Tom whispered, his voice trembling. What is this place? William walked over to the coffin, running a hand along its smooth surface. This, he said quietly, is what I believe to be a relic of some kind. It's ancient, older than anything I've ever come across. I think it's connected to whatever is happening here. Tom's gaze was fixed on the coffin, his mind racing. Why didn't you get rid of it? He asked. Why keep something like this in your home? William sighed, his hands still resting on the ebony wood. I tried. Believe me, I tried. But every time I attempted to move it, something would stop me. It's like it's anchored here, like it belongs here. Tom took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate carvings on the coffin's surface. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Strange, twisted symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Do you know what these symbols mean? William shook his head. No, I've tried to research them, but I haven't found anything conclusive. All I know is that they're not from any language or culture I'm familiar with. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The air in the room was thick with an oppressive energy, as if the very walls were closing in around them. And the boy? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The one I saw in the tunnel, do you think he's connected to this? William's expression darkened. I don't know, but I've seen things in this apartment. Shadows that move on their own, whispers in the night when there's no one around. And Henry, my son, he started acting strange. I don't know if it's related, but I can't ignore the possibility. Tom felt a deep sense of unease. What do you mean, acting strange? William hesitated, his eyes troubled. Henry's always been a quiet child, but recently he's become distant. He talks about people who aren't there, people from another time. He wakes up in the middle of the night, saying things in a language I don't understand. And there's something else, something that scares me more than anything. What is it? Tom asked, his heart pounding. William took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a fear that Tom hadn't seen before. A few nights ago, I found Henry standing in front of this room. The door was open, and he was just standing there, staring at the coffin. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was talking to the man inside. Tom felt the blood drain from his face. The man inside, William nodded, his expression grim. He said the man was telling him secrets about this place and about our family. He said the man was teaching him things. Tom could barely process what he was hearing. But there's no one in there, right? It's just an old coffin. William's eyes met Tom's, and in them, Tom saw the truth that William was too afraid to voice. I don't know what's in there, Tom, but whatever it is, it's not something that belongs in this world. The two men stood in silence, the weight of the room pressing down on them. Tom felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something far darker, something that had been lying dormant for years, perhaps centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. We need to get rid of it, Tom said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Whatever it takes, we need to get that thing out of here. William nodded, his face set with determination. You're right, but we need to be careful. If what you saw tonight is connected to this, then there's more at play than we realize. Tom agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Whatever had been awakened within Ravenswood Court was growing stronger, feeding off their fear, their uncertainty. And it wouldn't rest until it had consumed everything in its path. As they left the hidden room and the bookshelf slid back into place, sealing away the dark secret within, Tom couldn't help but glance back one last time. He felt as though the room was watching them, silently mocking their feeble attempts to resist its power. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Back in the study, the air felt lighter, less oppressive, but the unease lingered. Tom knew they had crossed a line, delved too deep into something they didn't fully understand, and now, there was no going back. "Tomorrow," William said as they exited the study, "we'll figure out a way to deal with this, together." Tom nodded, though he knew sleep would be impossible that night. The shadows of Ravenswood Court had already claimed his peace of mind, and he feared they would soon come for much more. As they said their goodbyes, Tom couldn't help but wonder what other secrets this place was hiding. He had a feeling they had only scratched the surface of a much larger, much darker mystery. And whatever lay beneath, it was waiting, biding its time, ready to consume them all. Tom left William's apartment with a heavy heart, his mind reeling from the evening's revelations. The events of the night weighed on him as he stepped into the elevator, watching the polished metal doors slide shut with a quiet hum. He had come to Ravenswood Court seeking a quiet job, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of the world, but now he found himself entangled in a mystery that defied all logic and reason. The elevator descended smoothly, the soft chime signaling each floor passed, but Tom barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the image of the coffin, its dark surface glinting ominously in the dim light of William's secret room. He couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the night were just the beginning, that something far more sinister was stirring within the walls of this seemingly serene complex. As the elevator doors opened to the ground floor, Tom was greeted by the quiet, empty lobby. The grandeur of the space, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, now felt oppressive, as if the building itself were watching him, waiting for his next move. The silence was unnerving, and he quickened his pace, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. He stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling tension that had settled over him. The mist that clung to the ground seemed to wrap around his ankles, urging him to leave the complex behind and never look back. But he knew he couldn't do that. Not now. Not after what he had seen. As Tom made his way back to his own modest apartment a few blocks away, his mind kept circling back to Henry, William's son. The boy's behavior, the strange things he had said, it all pointed to something far darker than a simple haunting. Tom had heard stories of spirits that could influence the living, of entities that could attach themselves to the innocent, feeding off their energy, their fear. Could Henry be under such an influence? Could the coffin and its contents be the source of whatever malevolent force had taken hold of the boy? The thought sent a chill through Tom, and he quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the darkened streets for any sign of movement. The town of Ashwood was quiet, its residents long since retired to bed, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their peaceful lives. When Tom finally reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him and leaned against it, closing his eyes as he tried to steady his breathing. The familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The events of the night had shattered any sense of safety he had once felt. He crossed the small living room to the window and peered out into the night, half expecting to see anything lurking in the shadows. But the street outside was empty, the only movement the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze. Tom turned away from the window, his thoughts returning to Henry. The boy had spoken of a man inside the coffin, a man who was teaching him things, sharing secrets. What could that mean? Tom had seen the way William's face had darkened when he spoke of his son, the fear that had crept into his eyes. William was a man of logic, of reason, yet even he couldn't deny the strange happenings within his home. And if Henry truly was communicating with whatever was inside that coffin, then they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, Tom decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He reached for the Bible that sat on the shelf beside his bed. It had been a long time since he had turned to faith for comfort, but tonight, he felt the need for some semblance of protection. He flipped through the worn pages, the familiar words bringing a small measure of peace to his troubled mind. As he read, the events of the night replayed in his head: the blooded woman, the ghostly boy, the ancient coffin. The connections were there, just out of reach, but Tom couldn't quite piece them together. What was the link between these seemingly disparate elements? And more importantly, How could they break whatever hold this dark force had over Henry? The night stretched on, the pages of the Bible blurring before Tom's tired eyes. He knew he wouldn't find the answers he sought in its pages, but it was enough to keep the worst of his fears at bay. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep, the Bible still clutched in his hands. Back at Ravenswood Court, the atmosphere in the Thompson household was anything but calm. William sat in his study, the door to the hidden room now securely locked, though the knowledge of what lay behind it gnawed at his thoughts. He had hoped that sharing his secret with Tom would ease the burden, but instead, it had only made the reality of the situation more stark. Emily had already gone to bed, unaware of the night's events. William had told her only what was necessary, that there had been an accident in the parking lot, and that Tom had needed his help. But even as he spoke the words, he had felt the lie pressing down on him. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain the impossible to someone who still believed that the world operated within the bounds of logic and reason? And then there was Henry. William's heart ached as he thought of his son, the boy who had once been so full of life and laughter. Henry had always been a quiet child, but recently, that quiet had taken on a darker tone. The boy who had once spent hours playing with his toys, exploring the world with wide-eyed wonder, now seemed distant, lost in a world of his own making, a world that William feared was being shaped by something far more sinister. William had tried to dismiss the strange things Henry said as the product of an overactive imagination, the fantasies of a young child. But the more he heard, the more he saw, the harder it became to deny the truth. Henry was changing, and whatever was causing that change was something beyond William's comprehension. He thought back to the night he had found Henry standing in front of the hidden room, the boy's small frame silhouetted in the dim light. Henry had spoken of the man inside, his voice eerily calm, as if he were discussing a casual acquaintance rather than a being that should not exist. And when William had looked into his son's eyes, he had seen something that chilled him to the core, something that wasn't Henry at all. William knew they couldn't go on like this. The influence of whatever was in that coffin was growing stronger, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed his son completely. He had to do something, but what? How could he fight something he didn't even understand? The answers seemed to elude him, slipping through his fingers like sand. But one thing was clear, he couldn't do it alone. Tom had seen the darkness too, and together, they might stand a chance of uncovering the truth. But even as William resolved to confront whatever malevolent force had taken root in his home, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Hash hash hash. The next morning, Tom woke with a sense of foreboding that had taken root deep in his chest. The events of the previous night were not the kind that faded with the first light of dawn. Instead, they had only grown more insistent, more urgent. He knew they needed to act quickly before whatever was happening at Ravenswood Court claimed another victim, whether it be Henry, William, or even himself. After a quick breakfast, Tom gathered what little courage he had left and made his way back to the complex. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that seemed to reflect the weight of the task ahead. As he approached the building, he noticed how still everything seemed. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that sent a shiver down his spine. When Tom arrived at William's apartment, he found the man already waiting for him, a grim expression on his face. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was clear that neither of them had slept well. They exchanged a few words, but both men knew that there was little left to say. It was time to confront the darkness that had taken hold of their lives. They made their way to the study, the familiar creak of the hidden door sending a fresh wave of dread through Tom. The dark room was just as he remembered it, the ebony coffin looming in the corner like a malignant presence, the strange symbols etched into its surface seeming to pulse with an unseen energy. "Are you ready?" William asked, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of fear. Tom nodded, though he wasn't sure if anyone could truly be ready for what they were about to face. Together, they stepped into the room, the door sliding shut behind them with a finality that sent a chill through the air. The two men stood in silence, the oppressive atmosphere of the room pressing down on them from all sides. The air was thick with a strange energy, a presence that seemed to swirl around them, waiting, watching. Tom moved toward the coffin, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt an almost magnetic pull, drawing him closer to the dark wood. The symbols on the surface seemed to shift and change as he approached, and he could feel a strange warmth emanating from within. "Do you think something is inside?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand resting on the lid of the coffin. "There's only one way to find out," he said quietly. With a deep breath, William began to lift the lid. The ancient hinges creaked in protest, the sound echoing in the confined space. As the lid rose, a thick, pungent smell filled the room, a mixture of earth and decay that made Tom gag. He forced himself to look inside, his eyes widening as the contents of the coffin were revealed. Inside lay the remains of a man, what was left of him. Anyway, the body was little more than a skeleton, the flesh long since decayed, but the clothes were still intact. The figure was dressed in an elaborate robe, the fabric rich and ornate, though faded with time. But it wasn't the man's appearance that sent a jolt of fear through Tom. It was the object clutched in the skeleton's bony hands. A book. An old, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the same strange symbols that adorned the coffin. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but as William reached for it, the symbols seemed to glow faintly, as if in response to his touch. "Careful," Tom warned, his voice trembling. William nodded, but his curiosity got the better of him. He carefully pried the book from the skeleton's grasp, the bones collapsing inward with a sickening crack as the book came free. As soon as the book was in William's hands, the air in the room seemed to change, growing colder, more oppressive. Tom watched as William opened the book, the pages crackling softly. The text inside was written in a language neither of them could understand, the symbols twisting and curling on the page like living things. But the power they held was unmistakable, a dark, ancient energy that seemed to seep from the very paper. "What is this?" William murmured, his eyes scanning the pages. "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice barely audible. "But I don't think it's something we should be messing with." Before William could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered, and a low, guttural sound filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. The symbols on the book began to glow brighter, pulsing with a malevolent energy. Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "We need to get out of here," he urged, his voice filled with fear. "Now!" But William seemed entranced, his eyes locked on the pages of the book as if he were in a trance. The sound grew louder, more distorted, and Tom could feel the darkness closing in around them. "William!" Tom shouted, grabbing his friend by the arm and shaking him. "We have to go." Finally, William seemed to snap out of it. He looked up at Tom, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling. "Let's go." They turned to leave, but as they did, the door to the hidden room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The candles were extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The guttural sound grew into a roar, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the door, his hands shaking. But no matter how hard he pushed, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was alive, determined to keep them inside. "We're trapped," William shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. Tom could feel the darkness closing in around them, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. Panic surged through him as he realized they were running out of time. The presence in the room was growing stronger, more aggressive, and it wouldn't be long before it consumed them both. Tom and William stood there, gasping for breath, the darkness around them suddenly still. Slowly, Tom reached for the door again, and this time, it opened without resistance. They stumbled out into the study, the door slamming shut behind them as if to seal away the evil within. They collapsed onto the floor, their breaths ragged, their hearts still racing from the ordeal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Finally, William broke the silence. "We have to destroy it," he said, his voice hoarse. "The coffin, the book, everything. We can't let that thing, whatever it is, stay here." Tom nodded in agreement. He didn't know what kind of power they had just encountered, but he knew it was something that couldn't be allowed to remain in their world. They had seen the darkness, felt its power, and barely escaped with their lives. But even as they made plans to rid Ravenswood Court of the evil that had taken root there, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were only delaying the inevitable. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. And next time, they might not be so lucky.